The desert Southwest has a way of keeping secrets. The vast stretches of sun-scorched earth, the endless miles of untamed wilderness, the silence that settles over the land like something permanent. All of it creates a landscape where the truth can disappear just as completely as a person can. And in Pima County, Arizona, that silence has become the defining feature of a case that has gripped the nation. Frustrated investigators, devastated a family, and left an entire community asking a single, agonizing question. What really happened to Nancy Guthrie? This is a case built on absence. The absence of answers. The absence of resolution. And most disturbingly, the deliberate, official withholding of evidence that authorities say exists, but cannot yet be revealed. When the sheriff of one of the largest counties in the United States steps before cameras and confirms that critical evidence has been collected, but refuses to say what it is, the world pays attention. And tonight, we are going to take you through everything we know, everything that has been documented, and everything that makes this case one of the most unsettling true crime stories unfolding in right now. If you are new here, and you want to stay informed on cases like this one, cases where the facts matter, where the victims matter, and where the truth is worth fighting for, make sure you subscribe to Samuel Vale Crime Chronicles and hit that like button right now. We cover the stories that demand attention, and we are not stopping until we have told every one of them. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Nancy Guthrie was a woman who belonged to the kind of community where people know their neighbors, where routines are familiar, and where an unexplained absence does not go unnoticed for long. She was part of the fabric of life in Pima County, Arizona, a region that encompasses the city of Tucson, and stretches outward into some of the most remote and rugged terrain in the American Southwest. Pima County covers more than 9,000 square miles, making it one of the largest counties in the continental United States by land area. It is a place of stark, dramatic beauty, and a place where the sheer scale of the landscape creates very real challenges for law enforcement responding to any serious incident. Nancy's case drew the attention of the Pima County Sheriff's Department, the primary law enforcement agency responsible for investigating crimes outside the jurisdiction of Tucson's city limits. The department is led by Sheriff Chris Nanos, a law enforcement official who has become a central and carefully watched figure in the public narrative surrounding what happened to Nancy Guthrie. Sheriff Nanos has chosen his words with notable precision in every public statement he has made about this case. And that precision has done as much to fuel public speculation as it has to inform it. Before we can understand the weight of what investigators eventually uncovered, we have to understand the world Nancy Guthrie inhabited, the rhythms of her daily life, the people around her, the community she was part of. She was a real person, not a case number, not a headline, not an avatar for tragedy. A real person with a life that mattered, relationships that were meaningful, and a presence that left a mark on those who knew her. When that presence disappeared, people noticed. And when the circumstances surrounding her disappearance began to come into focus, what emerged was something deeply troubling. The nature of disappearances in large, semi-rural jurisdictions like Pima County is inherently complicated. Unlike an urban environment where surveillance cameras are dense, witnesses are plentiful, and response times are fast, the sprawling geography of Pima County creates gaps in coverage, in witnesses, and in the physical evidence trail that investigators depend on to reconstruct what happened. When a person vanishes in that kind of landscape, the search area is almost incomprehensibly vast. Ground teams can cover only so much terrain. Aerial surveillance has its limits, and the desert itself is unforgiving in the way it treats evidence left exposed to heat, wind, and time. When Nancy Guthrie's case was first reported, law enforcement began the painstaking work of trying to piece together her final known movements. Every missing persons investigation begins with the same foundational questions. Where was she last seen? Who was the last person to have contact with her? Were there any signs of distress in the days or hours before she disappeared? Were there financial transactions, phone calls, or digital communications that could establish a timeline? And critically, was there any indication that her absence was voluntary? Or did the circumstances immediately suggest something more sinister? In cases where an adult disappears without prior indication of plans to leave, law enforcement must walk a careful line. They cannot immediately assume the worst. They must follow procedure, gather evidence, and allow the investigation to develop at its own pace. But in cases where something feels fundamentally wrong, where the circumstances do not align with any explanation that does not involve harm, that investigative process takes on a different urgency. And from what has been publicly reported about the Nancy Guthrie case, the sense of urgency was not slow to arrive. The Pima County Sheriff's Department opened a formal investigation and began working the case with the seriousness it demanded. Search efforts were launched. Interviews were conducted. The investigative machinery of a major American law enforcement agency was brought to bear on the question of what happened to Nancy Guthrie. And yet, despite that machinery, despite the resources committed, despite the hours logged and the ground covered, the answers did not come quickly. They did not come easily. And as days stretched into weeks, and weeks stretched further, the public began to pay attention in a way that would ultimately bring national scrutiny to the case. Community members rallied. The kind of grassroots response that defines tight-knit Arizona communities emerged. People who cared, people who knew Nancy or knew people who knew her. People who simply could not accept that a woman could disappear without someone fighting to find out why. That sense of communal urgency created pressure on investigators, a pressure that is always a double-edged instrument. On one side, public engagement generates tips, amplifies awareness, and ensures that resources remain committed to a case. On the other side, it can complicate an investigation by circulating unverified information, drawing in well-meaning but potentially disruptive attention, and placing immense emotional weight on law enforcement to produce answers on a timeline that investigative reality may not support. Sheriff Nanos and his department navigated that pressure carefully. Official statements were measured, details were limited, and the information released to the public was calibrated, enough to acknowledge the seriousness of the investigation, not enough to jeopardize it. This is the new reality of high-profile disappearance cases in the digital age. The investigation does not happen solely in a detective's office or in a forensic laboratory. It happens simultaneously in the court of public opinion, on platforms where information spreads faster than it can be verified, where theories calcify into certainties, and where the line between awareness and interference can become dangerously thin. Law enforcement agencies across the country have had to adapt to this reality, developing communication strategies that acknowledge the public's legitimate interest in justice while protecting the operational integrity of active investigations. Sheriff Nanos demonstrated exactly that kind of strategic communication in the updates he provided regarding Nancy Guthrie. He did not overpromise. He did not dismiss public concern. He did not provide the kind of false reassurance that can poison a community's trust when the reality eventually contradicts it. Instead, he maintained a posture of careful, deliberate engagement, acknowledging what could be acknowledged, withholding what needed to be withheld, and trusting that the public could understand the difference, even when the frustration of that withholding was immense. And then came the statement that changed the public conversation entirely. In a move that was at once transparent and deliberately vague, Sheriff Chris Nanos publicly confirmed that investigators are in possession of evidence connected to the Nancy Guthrie case. Evidence that is real, evidence that is in hand, and evidence that, as of the time of his statement, cannot be released to the public. He was explicit about the reasoning. Withholding the information is necessary for the integrity of the ongoing investigation. That is the language of a law enforcement official who understands exactly what he is doing. He is not hiding the existence of evidence. He is refusing to disclose its nature. And that distinction, subtle as it may seem, is enormously significant. In active criminal investigations, the deliberate withholding of evidentiary specifics is not unusual. It is, in fact, standard practice in cases where the stakes are high enough to warrant it. When investigators choose to keep the nature of their evidence confidential, they are typically operating from one or more very specific strategic considerations. They may be in the process of forensically verifying the evidence, ensuring that what they believe they have actually holds up to rigorous scientific scrutiny before it is made public and potentially challenged. They may be building a case that depends on a suspect not knowing exactly what investigators possess, so that the element of surprise can be preserved for a moment when it will have maximum impact. They may be protecting the identity of a witness or a source of information whose safety could be compromised if the nature of that information became publicly known. Or they may be operating under the constraints of legal proceedings. A grand jury investigation, for example, carries mandatory secrecy requirements that prohibit even the acknowledgement of specific evidentiary material. In any of these scenarios, Sheriff Nanos' statement makes complete sense. The evidence exists. It matters enough to protect. And protecting it for now is the right call. But for the public, and especially for those closest to Nancy, that explanation, reasonable as it is, does little to quiet the anguish of not knowing. The theories that emerged in the wake of Sheriff Nanos' statement were numerous and varied. Online communities zeroed in on several distinct possibilities each, grounded in the logic of what kinds of evidence typically prove most decisive in cases like this one. Digital evidence has become one of the most powerful tools available to modern criminal investigators. Cell phone records can place a device, and therefore its owner, at a specific location, at a specific time, often with remarkable precision. Text messages, emails, and social media communications can establish relationships, reveal conflicts, document plans, and contradict the statements made by persons of interest during interviews. Financial transaction records can show movement, purchases, and patterns of behavior that might otherwise remain invisible. In an age when virtually every aspect of daily life generates a digital record, investigators working a case have access to a kind of historical documentation that was unimaginable to law enforcement a generation ago. If investigators in the Nancy Guthrie case have obtained digital evidence of this nature, its potential evidentiary value would be enormous, and the reasons to keep it sealed would be equally substantial. Surveillance evidence is another category that has repeatedly proven decisive in modern criminal cases. Security cameras, traffic cameras, doorbell cameras, and other recording devices create a web of visual documentation across both urban and residential environments. If investigators obtained footage placing a specific individual in a specific location at a critical time, a location or time that contradicts a stated alibi or establishes a connection to Nancy's final movements, the strategic value of keeping that footage confidential until the right moment would be immediately obvious to any experienced prosecutor. Forensic evidence, DNA, trace evidence, fingerprints, or biological material connected to a crime scene represents another possibility that many observers have speculated about. Forensic analysis takes time. Laboratory processes are methodical by necessity, because the stakes of getting it wrong are too high. If investigators recovered forensic evidence in this case and submitted it for analysis, the results of that analysis, particularly if they pointed clearly to a specific individual, would be precisely the kind of material that would be kept sealed, while the broader evidentiary framework of a prosecution was assembled. None of these specific theories have been confirmed by authorities. They represent the logical framework within which investigators typically operate, applied to the known facts of this case. The truth of what Sheriff Nanos and his team possess remains, for now, behind a wall of professional discretion. What is not speculation, what is established fact, is that the case has generated sustained, serious attention at a level that goes beyond typical local news coverage. The involvement of a county sheriff in direct public communication about evidentiary developments, the breadth of community response, and the national reach of the online conversation surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance all speak to the weight that this case carries. This is not a story that has faded from view as time has passed. If anything, each new development has deepened public engagement rather than diminishing it. That sustained attention carries its own kind of significance. In the history of American criminal justice, public pressure has played a meaningful role in cases that might otherwise have been allowed to go cold. Investigators who know that a case is being watched, that the community is tracking every development, that families are not quietly accepting silence, tend to remain committed to that case in ways that benefit the pursuit of justice. This is not a criticism of law enforcement. It is simply an acknowledgement of how accountability functions in a democratic society. The public's attention is a legitimate and often productive force in the investigative process, when that attention is channeled responsibly. Sheriff Nanos' decision to publicly confirm the existence of undisclosed evidence can be read, at least in part, as a response to that dynamic. By acknowledging that progress is being made, that evidence has been collected, that investigators are not simply waiting with empty hands, he is communicating to both the public and to Nancy's loved ones that this case has not been abandoned. That is an important message, and the fact that he delivered it deliberately, without overpromising and without providing details that could compromise the investigation, suggests a law enforcement leader who understands both the human stakes of the case and the procedural requirements of pursuing justice correctly. For Nancy's family, the weeks and months since her disappearance have been defined by a particular kind of torment that is difficult to articulate to anyone who has not lived it. The absence of a clear answer, the not knowing, creates a psychological burden that sits differently than grief, because grief at least has a defined object. When a loved one disappears, and the circumstances remain unclear, the family is left suspended in a state of unbearable ambiguity. They cannot fully mourn, because they do not yet know the full truth. They cannot fully hope, because the evidence of harm is too present to ignore. They exist in a space between those two realities, and every day that passes without resolution deepens that suffering. Sheriff Nanos' statement offered something rare in that context, a signal that the investigation is moving forward. That evidence exists, that investigators are working with material that matters. For a family that has been living with uncertainty, the confirmation that investigators have something, even without knowing what that something is, represents a fragile but real form of acknowledgement. It says, "We have not forgotten. We are still working. The truth is still being pursued." That acknowledgement does not make the waiting easier. Nothing makes the waiting easier. But it matters. The broader context of this case extends beyond its specific facts into questions that resonate across American society. The disappearance and death of women, particularly in communities where access to investigative resources may be more limited than in densely populated urban centers, represents an ongoing crisis that demands sustained public attention. The statistics surrounding missing and murdered women in the United States reflect patterns of vulnerability that policymakers, law enforcement agencies, and communities are still grappling with. Cases like Nancy Guthrie's remind us that these statistics represent individual human lives that had value, relationships that mattered, and futures that were stolen. Pima County, with its unique combination of urban infrastructure and vast rural terrain, presents investigative challenges that are not unique to Arizona. Across the American West and Southwest, law enforcement agencies routinely face the challenge of investigating serious crimes across geographies that were never designed for ease of surveillance or evidence recovery. The terrain itself can become a weapon, a means by which evidence is concealed, distances are exploited, and the passage of time works against justice. Understanding these challenges does not excuse outcomes that fall short of justice, but it does contextualize them in ways that are important for an informed public to appreciate. Sheriff Nanos and his department are operating in exactly this kind of environment, and the fact that they have collected evidence, real, meaningful evidence, despite those challenges, is itself significant. As this investigation continues to unfold, the questions that define it remain sharp and unresolved. What happened to Nancy Guthrie in her final hours? What evidence have investigators collected? And how definitively does it speak to the circumstances of her disappearance and death? Is the case moving toward a resolution that will bring accountability to those responsible? And when will the sealed evidence that Sheriff Nanos referenced become part of the public record? These questions do not have answers today. The investigation is active. The evidence is protected. The legal and forensic processes that must precede any public disclosure are still underway. And the timeline for resolution, however, deeply the public wants to know it, remains in the hands of investigators and prosecutors who are working toward a goal that must be pursued correctly, even when correctly means slowly. What we can say with certainty is this: the case is not dormant. The evidence exists. The law enforcement officials responsible for this investigation have confirmed that they are working with material they consider significant enough to protect. And the public attention surrounding Nancy Guthrie's story, attention that includes the community she was part of, the family that loves her, and the thousands of people across the country who have followed this case with genuine concern is not fading. Nancy Guthrie deserved a full life. She deserved safety. She deserved the protection that every person in a civilized society is owed. What she received instead was something no one should ever experience. And what she deserves now, from investigators, from the legal system, from the public that has chosen to pay attention, is the full, uncompromising pursuit of truth and accountability. That pursuit is ongoing, and we will be here for every development that comes. This case is far from over. The evidence is sealed, the investigation is active, and the answers that Nancy's family and this nation deserve are still working their way toward the surface. When they arrive, and they will arrive, the story will enter a new and critical phase, and Samuel Vale Crime Chronicles will be here to cover every moment of it with the depth, the honesty, and the respect that a case like this one demands. If this video gave you a clearer picture of the Nancy Guthrie case, and the extraordinary statement made by Sheriff Nanos, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Samuel Vale Crime Chronicles. Your support keeps this work going. It ensures that cases like Nancy's stay in the public eye, that victims are not forgotten, and that the pursuit of truth has a platform that refuses to look away. Hit subscribe, turn on your notifications, and stay with us, because this story is not finished, and neither are we. Justice for Nancy Guthrie. The truth is coming.